So here we are then at Daniel chapter 11. And to say that Daniel 11 is a difficult passage to preach on is a great understatement. Now, I'm not going to go through it in great detail. Perhaps in a Bible study there would be value in going through it verse by verse. However, I don't believe that would be helpful to us this evening. Much of what is found in this chapter we have seen previously in Daniel's vision recorded for us in chapter 8. There is, though, of course, as the length of the chapter suggests, there is a lot more detail in this 11th chapter. Now, one of the difficulties with preaching on this chapter is that it simply records historic events, but records them hundreds of years before they happened. Now, as I've said before, it is because of such accurate depictions of events that many people refuse to believe that Daniel himself wrote them. Now, as Christians, we recognise that prophetic statements, they don't tend to be as clear and precise as, as after the event history is. But we know that our God is omnipresent, both in space and in time. So our future is not the future to God. So it's not in the least bit difficult for him to provide the kind of detailed information about what we consider the future, if that suits his purpose. And it does have to be said that even with the detail that we have here, there is still an air of mystery, if I can use that word, about the way these things in this chapter are described. Now then, chapter 11 is just a continuation of chapter 10 in the same way that chapter 12 is a continuation of chapter 11. And so then, remember, the chapter divisions are man-made. They weren't originally there, of course. But the first verse that we read states, "Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him." The one who says this to Daniel is the Son of God, as we saw last time. He has informed Daniel that there is a battle going on in the spiritual realm. He indicates that there are demons behind the idols that are worshipped by the nations. And these fallen angels do all that they can to thwart the purposes of God. Now, of course, that's ultimately futile. But they do have some apparent success. We said that they resist God in the same way, or in a similar way, to humans resisting God in the physical realm. And to emphasise the point, Daniel is told that the reason that the Babylonians fell was because Darius the Mede was confirmed in his victory and strengthened by the Son of God. In other words, these things came to pass according to the decree of God, not through any strength of will of the Medes and Persians. Now, Daniel has already been told that the Persians will eventually be replaced by the Greeks. And he's now given more information as about when that will actually happen. He's told that the Persian Empire will be around for a little while yet, but in 4 kings' time, the king will arouse the Greeks. And that king is Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as we know him in the book of Esther. And if you remember the book of Esther, you'll recall that it opened with a magnificent feast. And many believe that this feast was laid on for him to get support for his ill-fated war with Greece. And so eventually then Alexander the Great arose and conquered not only the Persians, but practically everybody that stood before him. As it says in verse 3, a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. But just as we saw in chapter 8, and as history relates to us, after the death of Alexander, the Greek Empire settled into 4 unequal quarters. They were all Greek, but they didn't all get along. In verses 5 to 20, which of course we didn't read, but we are given plenty of information about the goings-on in this fractured Greek Empire. But it's all building up to someone who will appear almost out of nowhere, but who will become a terrible persecutor of the people of God. And so it is that verses 21 to 35, which we also didn't read, but they speak clearly of the person and actions of Antiochus Epiphanes. And the information in those verses, you can read them at your leisure, please do, but the information we have is so clear that there really is no alternative than it being in relation to that particular ruler. Now, I don't want to cover too much of the same ground that we went over in chapter 8, but we are again told in verse 31 that Antiochus, he would end the daily sacrifice and raise up the abomination that maketh desolate. And he did that by, he removed the altar of burnt offerings from the temple, and he replaced it with a pagan altar. This man was extraordinarily wicked. But then in verses 36 to the end of the chapter, there are things written about a man who can't possibly be Antiochus Epiphanes. And that's another difficulty with preaching from this particular chapter, because there's no apparent break between verses 35 and 36. And if we didn't have all the information that we do have about Antiochus Epiphanes, we might read that passage through and think it's all talking about the same person. But there is something there. There is something that indicates a movement from one person to another. In the verses leading up to verse 35, we have a picture of Antiochus gaining support from unbelieving Jews. They are described as such as do wickedly against the covenant, it says that in verse 32. But there are also the faithful who are at work. Of them, it's said in verse 33, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many. But sadly, these faithful will be dealt with very harshly. But notice what it said. It said of them, of the faithful, in verse 35. And some of them of understanding shall fall to try them, and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. Now we have to acknowledge that there is a certain vagueness about a term like the time of the end. However, in this context, it can be seen to mean the end of the age. And that becomes more apparent as the narrative flows in to chapter 12, where the end of the age is definitely in focus. So with that in mind, then we can have a better grasp of verse 35 of this 11th chapter. We see those of understanding who instruct many, even in the direst of circumstances, will do so right to the end. The faithful will always do that, in other words. And so we can then understand how it is that we move from Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC to the Antichrist at the end of the age. And that particular transition Daniel has seen before. It would not have been a weird thing to him. In the dream that he had, that's recorded for us in chapter 7, he sees a little horn arise, and that's patently the Antichrist, as we saw when we read that. We see that the Antichrist will appear at the end of the age. But then in the vision that he had in chapter 8, he again sees a little horn, but this is patently not the Antichrist, but is Antiochus Epiphanes. And this then may help us understand why there is all of this attention here on the rise of the Greek Empire and of Antiochus Epiphanes in particular. Because remember, the Apostle John tells us in 1 John 2 verse 18, even now are there many antichrists. If there are many precursors to this Antichrist at the end of the age, why don't we have the same kind of detail about them, that we have about this one in the 2nd century BC? But the answer to that is actually quite straightforward. We don't need more than one description if they all fit into the same mould. And in addition, we can say that antichrists aren't just wicked men, there's lots of them, but they are a particular sort of wicked man. And Antiochus would appear to epitomise their qualities. In him, we see the marks of an antichrist are subtlety, deceit, a yearning for power, and a cloak of religion. All these, including and especially the cloak of religion, will work towards raising this person up and becoming deified in his own eyes. As Paul wrote in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 4 about this one at the end of the age, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, as we see, there is a fair bit of information concerning this Antichrist, both here in Daniel and also in the New Testament. So we can't just ignore it. However, while we need to be wise, as Christians, we need to ensure that our thoughts are focused on Christ, not the Antichrist. That would be altogether the wrong way round. There are people who would give you the impression that, the Antichrist is the chap next door or something like that. Or if it's not, then it's some president or something. They're always talking about the Antichrist and never, or hardly ever, about Christ. Well, that's the wrong way round. But given that God has revealed these things to us, we can't just ignore them altogether. Here in Daniel 11, we have noted that up to verse 35, specific events in the Greek Empire and in Antiochus himself can be pinned down. You can look at those verses and see where they happened in history a few hundred years after Daniel wrote about them. But in the rest of the chapter, from that point on, that's not the case. And for example, Moab, that's mentioned in verse 41, well, Moab had ceased to exist by the 2nd century BC. But those nations in that verse, Edom, Moab and Ammon, they were among the traditional enemies of the people of God. So what we see in this passage then is that the Antichrist will overthrow many countries, and the only ones that will escape will be those who already hate God. I have to say I'm very thankful to Stuart Olliott for that particular observation. I didn't spot it myself, but you can see it. Once you see it, you can see it. But again, I remind you that our focus must be on Christ. If we get distracted from him, we only end up losing out. However, the importance of being aware of the Antichrist is that Jesus will not return before the rise of this one. That day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. That's what Paul wrote in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 3. However, the thing that we need to understand is that even when things look their darkest, it is up to the faithful to remain faithful and to help bring others to a knowledge of the truth. They that understand among the people shall instruct many. That needs to be us. And what would keep us going in dark times? What would keep us going if we did indeed find ourselves living in the time of the Antichrist? Surely it must be the words that end this chapter. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Again, as Paul described in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 8, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. As I said last week, the future is bright. We may find ourselves living in times of great peril, so we must face up to that possibility. Yet, as Jesus himself taught us, whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. Matthew 16 and verse 25. Now, having not looked in great detail at this chapter, there are still a few lessons I would like for us to draw out. And the first of these is summarised at the end of verse 32. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And you will see that that is set against a backdrop of wickedness. Specifically here, that Antiochus is winning over those who are outwardly Jews, but inwardly they are unbelieving. And also at a time when the faithful are indeed fiercely persecuted. Yet despite that, the people of God are a people of action. And that's worth taking note of, because history shows us how very few stand their ground when many fall away. John Calvin, he sagely notes that 100 can be led astray by just one, but the constancy of 100 is scarcely sufficient to retain one in his position. And he's right when he says that. My friend Gary Brady, he used to give the example of how easy it is for a person to pull another person down off a table, but how extremely difficult it is for that person on the table to lift a person up from the floor to them. We all know the truth of those examples. The natural depravity of the unsaved sinner makes it impossible for them to stand firm for God. But even the saved sinner, even you and me, we feel our weakness. That old nature still fills our hearts with fear when trouble assails us. And this really ought to make us sober and serious people. Now, I'm not saying for a moment there can't be any humour in our lives, but what I'm saying is that we must not be frivolous and superficial. If we are, I would say we stand no chance of doing any kind of exploits in such perilous times. Some may look on a dark future and say, well, that doesn't bother me. I will stand strong. For people who think like that, I would have to say that the probability of them doing so is very high, that they won't be able to do it. In 1 Corinthians 10:12, the apostle writes, wherefore, let him that thinketh he stand take heed lest he fall. For as it says in Proverbs 16 and verse 18, pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. And you know that the Apostle Peter is perhaps the biggest warning in this regard. We read of him saying to Jesus in Matthew 26:33, he said, though all men shall be offended because of thee, yet will I never be offended. And yet in a matter of hours, what was happening? He was denying that he even knew Jesus. So there's no point in us thinking that we are strong enough to withstand come the evil day. And yet, we are categorically told that the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. How can this be, given that we know all about our own weakness? Well, the answer is that it is not our own strength. The Apostle Paul tells us what the Lord Jesus said to him, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." And we read that in 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 9. And so Paul could go on to say, "For when I am weak, then am I strong." And in Philippians 4:13, "I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me." You can see it is a great folly to trust in ourselves. But if we are in Christ, then we will find that we are strengthened for things we otherwise could not imagine. Now, this does, of course, strongly urge us to ensure that we do know our God. And we need to do so now in a time of peace and tranquility. We need to make use of what our God has provided for us so that we are not all at sea, as it were, in times of trial and trouble. And how do we ensure that we know God? Well, there's only one way. That is through reading our Bibles. Now, it is true, of course, that all of creation announces God, as it were. It certainly reveals God and his character to us, but I don't think we could honestly say it brings us to know him as the scriptures do. You know how the Ten Commandments are introduced? "I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." We see that God is not just God, he is our God. And it is only the Bible that can reveal God to us in such a way that we can know him as our God. In other words, we shouldn't let our Bibles gather dust. To be well grounded in what the Bible teaches is to be protected from those whose words seem winsome, but which are only designed to lead us astray. And so, being strengthened by the Lord, you will be able to do exploits. And not only will you be able to do them, but you'll be expected to do them. It says they shall be strong and do exploits. And if we are expected to be a people of action in such dark times, how much more is that true in good times? It is a sad fact that we have a tendency to become slow in our witness and flabby in our service when the good times are rolling. No matter how many times we are told not to be conformed to this world, but transformed by the renewing of our minds, the allure of the world still manages to sink its hooks into us. Something that appears quite harmless and indeed might be quite legitimate takes our fancy, but its attraction grows and it begins to take over. Suddenly we can't do without it. And little by little, serving the Lord falls into second place. And in the worst case scenario, of course, gets pushed out altogether. So I say to you all, be on your guard. Your calling is to labour for the Lord, to be obedient to him with all gladness. So be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. If you should notice anything taking hold of your affections, mind that whatever that thing is, that it does not lead you away to faithlessness. And if you have excess time, well, look out for more things to do for the Lord. Now, I can't really emphasize the importance of doing so, I can't really emphasize that enough. You see, this passage, it also informs us that the truth also attracts hypocrites. The faithful servants of God who do exploits and shall instruct many are said to fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days. And then it says in verse 34, now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. So what Daniel was telling us there is that when that fierce sword of persecution falls upon the faithful people of God, well, they will receive some help, but it's only a little help. The church may appear numbered to such a degree that it would not be too unreasonable for the faithful to expect more help. The problem that this draws out is that many have been joined to the faithful with flatteries. The Hebrew word has the suggestion of slipperiness. These ones, they've not been sincere in their profession. They are, as I say, they are hypocrites. And you really do not want to be found among such a number. We know nobody likes a hypocrite. But even if you are so adept at being one that nobody else notices at the time, you will be found out. I suppose the question could arise, why would anyone want to join the church if they do not sincerely believe what the church believes and stands for? Why would anyone do that? And we can't answer that fully. We can't answer that without being able to peer into their hearts. Something we can't do, of course. But we do know that people do it. And some people are attracted to the teaching of the Bible without any desire to submit themselves to it. We know that that is the case. And the worst thing for such hypocrites is to find out too late. To arrive at judgment day only to hear those dreadful words, I never knew you, depart from me, ye that work iniquity. If today you make excuses for not obeying God, if you think to yourself that it doesn't matter that you are on the half-hearted side, if you enjoy coming to church and being among the Lord's people, but hive off chunks of your life to where you believe Jesus cannot touch them, beware. But while you draw breath, it is not too late to put right your relationship with God. But when your last breath flees away, then it will be too late. And so what I say to you as I come to a close is to remember this. Alexander the Great fell at the height of his victories. Antiochus Epiphanes fell at the height of his cruelty. The Antichrist will fall at the height of his terrors. All who oppose God fall at his decree. If you are a child of God, then you are on the Lord's side. You stand with the victor. No matter what comes your way in this life, the victor's crown and glory awaits you. And I trust that your hearts will be inflamed with love as you ponder on such thoughts tonight. Amen.